Thank you everybody for coming today. Before we get started, I would like to mention that this lecture is made possible by the generous support of the Callison Architecture Endowment for the School of Architecture CAF Lecture Series. And I would like to welcome Dr. Janet Loebach. Janet comes from us from Cornell University, and she is going to be our second lecture in the series on the theme collective. So a little bit about Janet. Dr. Loebach is the Evelyn Edwards Millman Assistant Professor for Child Development and the Human-Centered Design at Cornell University. Her research efforts focus on the development of inclusive and child and youth-friendly environments and examining the impacts of the built and natural environments on young people's behaviors and healthy development. Dr. Loebach has particular expertise in the design of outdoor play and recreation spaces and capturing the children's play and learning behaviors through innovative methodologies, including behavior mapping. Much of her work also engages children and youth directly in participatory assessment and co-design of their everyday spaces such as playgrounds, schools, and community spaces. Dr. Loebach is the chair of the Children, Youth, and Environment Network at the Environmental Design and Research Association and sits on the editorial board of the Journals for Children, Youth, and Environments, Cities and Health, and Psych Ecology. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Janet Loebach.
Thank you so much. How's the volume? Good? Good at the back? All right, let me know if it gives you any grief at any time. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for coming today, taking time out of your work day. I was really not just interested to come, but really found when I understood what the sort of mandate aims of your lecture series this year, found it like really aligned with much about my own work. And so from your, I'm gonna have to coordinate this. There we go. From some of the language that was provided to me, these words really define the research and the design work that I do and the people that I do them with. And so I'm gonna be talking to you a little bit today about collective design, transformative design, not only for children and youth, but with them particularly. This takes a minute to get my coordinating here. So what am I going to kind of cover today? I'm going to try and convince you why we should be investing in creating child-enabling environments, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. And then once I convince you of that, then I say, okay, how then do we do it? How do we do it authentically, genuinely, effectively, and ethically? And then I want to share a little bit about how should children and youth actually be contributing to the collective nature of processes and outputs of design. So I'm hoping I'm going to convert a lot of you by the end of the lecture today. I want to take a second, a little interactive part. I want you to think back to a particularly strong memory of play in your childhood, or a particularly special play environment. Think a little bit about, what was that space? What did it look like and feel like? What did you actually do there? Who did you do it with? And I'm hoping we'll have a few people willing to share. We have a mic here. Anyone have a place, space, or environment setting that sticks out for them? One over here. One person over here.
I had this neighbor, and she had these dogwood trees, and we would climb them and then jump in between the trees, and that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, very strong. You'll appreciate what's coming up. Okay, anyone else? Similar or different?
There's a small little water park where I lived, and it had like these little turtles that you could climb on, and it had like a small little ship that you could go inside, and it was fun.
Okay, how old would you have been when you're thinking of yourself at that space? How old, roughly?
I mean, definitely like elementary school, like
Okay.
pretty young, yeah.
All right, great, thank you. Anyone else? One more, maybe? Have something like really different than that? Oh, one over here. Boy, we're just making you go like one far side to the other.
I should just like run down there and grab it. I would say my next door neighbors growing up had a bunch of broken washer machines and like dryers and stuff like that, and we would play in them.
Play in them, yeah.
And around them, on top of them.
Okay, so
things
can I
like
also
that.
ask, were there any adults present at this time? Probably not, right?
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah.
I don't know what present actually means in that context.
Yes. Okay, so there is a reason which we'll talk about today why most of us actually, if we think about it, have at least one pretty strong memory of a play environment, a play setting or activity. And for some people, and this was particularly my experience, this really summed up my childhood space. I lived in a rural area, and I could go as far as I wanted, even as at a young age, and we sort of had these wild, forested, and sort of overgrown areas, and spent most of my time in there. This, similar to our first, this might be a familiar environment to you. There's a lot of research been done about like fort building, den building, how common it is like across cultures, very, very common childhood play activity. This sort of reminds me of your washing machines. We sort of had this sort of scrap material adventure play. If you were lucky enough, this might be your experience. I'm guessing this is not the kind of thing that came to mind for any of you. And yet, this kind of play environment is a very typical response, what we typically provide in response to children's needs in communities, particularly. And they often tend to be also fenced, or sort of these designated children's spaces. And there are some issues around that, not just how sort of boring and sterile this is, but there's actually a mindset that these are actually the only legitimate spaces, public spaces for kids, and that they, any kind of play or childish behavior that might be happening in a non-play space tends to be considered illegitimate, and people get annoyed and mad and yell at your parents for letting you run around the public space. So we have tended to, our response in community planning, et cetera, is to sort of designate these children's spaces, and then we tend to provide relatively boring opportunities within those spaces. So I'm going to try and convince you today why we should be investing a little bit more in creating child-enabling environments. You've probably heard the term child-friendly or youth-friendly. I used to use that. I use child-enabling now because child-friendly is a very passive term. And it's kind of, it feels like a passive relationship between the child and the environment. Versus what I'm going to talk to you today about is how important the physical environment is in children's behaviors across the board. And so child-enabling environment is one that's really actively directed toward helping kids develop and thrive. So why? Why do we do this? First of all, the main thing is that they have the right. They have the right to environments that are dedicated or are really supportive of their needs and preferences. We are about 30 years on now from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that designated rights for all children across the world, and beyond saying they have the right to be safe and they have right to family life and play and leisure activities and spaces. One thing that was also enshrined was that children have the right to be heard and participate in decisions that affect them, and to be valued, respected, treated fairly. We tend to think of kids as human becomings instead of human beings. We tend to think about, okay, what can we provide for them to help support them so they make it all the way to adulthood and are healthy adults. We don't always acknowledge that they are not just beings, human beings of today, but they are actually citizens, not just of tomorrow, but of today. Another reason we might want to particularly look at child-enabling environments is that when we look at our physical spaces, designed or natural, when we look at them from the lens of a group that might be particularly vulnerable or marginalized or might be particularly sensitive to their environments, that lens can actually often help us identify issues or gaps, even design solutions, planning solutions, policy solutions that can be really helpful to other vulnerable groups. So I do kind of think of kids in this way a little bit as an indicator species, but I don't actually agree with the rest of this quote. It gets used a lot. I don't actually think that if we design well for children, it'll be good for everybody. Children's needs are not going to fit everybody's needs. But I think for many, many reasons, they can be a really helpful lens for us to be looking at, and we can do a lot of successful design solutions for lots of people when we think particularly from the perspective of supporting children. The other thing that we tend to forget, because we used to be kids, we think, I remember what it was like to kind of look at the world as a kid. But we actually know from environmental psych, from environmental perception research, that kids are fundamentally perceiving their environments in a different way than adults. Because partly, if anyone's familiar with the theory of affordances, our perception of our environment is often aligned with our motivations, our needs, our desires. And those are very different for children, often because those needs, desires are actually related to supporting their health and development. And so they are fundamentally seeing the world in different ways and will see different opportunities. They're also more captive to their local environments. They don't drive. We actually don't let kids go very far on their own anymore. This is a big cultural shift. And so they're very influenced by they can't escape those environments that are near to them. So if they are resource-poor environments, they have little ability themselves to find the supportive environments that they need. And they also are one of the groups that has the fewest opportunities to actually contribute to, like share their needs, their preferences, their ideas, and actually have an impact on decision-making or policy-making. And yet they're one of the groups that is most affected by our environmental choices. The other thing is that, kids these days, things in terms of children's health, I mean, we're certainly, children in most cases are much better off than, say, they were 100 years ago. But we have some very significant, worrisome contemporary child health issues. One of them is a change in play, which talk about lower physical activity, and we're seeing high rates of obesity, skyrocketing mental health and well-being issues amongst children. Vitamin D deficiency has reemerged. Vitamin D, you can get all you need from vitamin D from 30 minutes outside a day. That's changing because children are spending much less time outside. So all these contemporary health issues, we actually have pretty good, robust research that says that these are all impacted by the physical environments, either positively or negatively. And so another reason why one way to actually impact children's health and development might be environmental interventions or good design from the beginning. There's also some that suggest that sort of a child-friendly lens is also, there's some connections with how we might meet sustainable development goals and have more resilient environments, which I could go down the rabbit hole there, but. So I'm suggesting that we can have, we can actually have transformative impacts when we design for children. Possibly one of the ways we can have one of the biggest sort of population level impacts is if we actually look at the environments that we are providing, and when we improve the health environments of children and youth, we're actually also there is a spillover effect to their communities. So just within about 5 years after the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, UNICEF launched this initiative called Child-Friendly Cities. Has anybody heard of that initiative? By hands? One person, great, okay. So basically what they're saying, they're saying we need to honor the rights of children, and that a child-friendly city or town, community, neighborhood is one where those voices, the needs, priorities, preferences of children are not only thought about, but they're actually integral to design, decision-making, public policies. The United States is the only large nation that has still not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. UNICEF, USA, is the only organization in the US that has been recognized for upholding these rights, or the convention, and this Child-Friendly Cities Initiative was launched in 1996. The US version of it only launched in 2020, but we're getting there. But when we actually look at whether our existing communities are child-friendly, UNICEF has ranked US as 36 out of 38 in terms of child well-being indicators. You can hear state by state, we have some that are also worse than others. We have 10 million children that are considered right now to be living in low opportunity neighborhoods, communities. And this is disproportionate for some cohorts of children. So a very recent report by the Annie Casey Foundation, they put out this kids count data book every year. And their 2024 report says that the US is failing to provide the opportunities and support that are needed for children to thrive, or we're failing to remove the obstacles that are gonna help them get to adulthood in a healthy way. And this is particularly for American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, and Latino children. So we also know that the impacts are not proportionate. We have lower income and racial and ethnic minority children are much more greatly impacted, much more at risk for health problems, and much more likely to have healthy environmental supports. This includes much less infrastructure for physical activity and for play, much harder time accessing affordable, healthy food. We have higher rates of obesity, mental health, vitamin D. These tend to be the communities where they have removed or really reduced recess time. They either don't have access to high quality or safe parks and places. They tend to have fewer green spaces and street trees. So one initiative I'm involved in right now, it's called Growing Up in Cities. This is the third wave of the initiative. So there was, those who are familiar with Kevin Lynch, he did a famous sort of study in the 1970s. There was a wave of about 13 countries that looked at the experience of children in cities in the 90s, and now we have about 21 or so countries that are looking at what's the experience of contemporary kids in cities around the world. So I am co-leading the US study, and we began by working with, there are 4 cities that are the first that are pursuing child-friendly city status. So San Francisco, Minneapolis, Houston, and Prince George County, which is the county that just kind of circles Washington, D.C. And so part of this children-friendly cities initiative is that these cities have to do quite a bit of work. It's about a 2-3 year process where they have to really show that they have demonstrated results, changes that are related to different CFCI outcomes. They have to demonstrate that they have stable, meaningful, and inclusive participation of children, and that they are dedicated to eliminating discrimination against children within government policy and actions. So Houston, Texas is the first to get this status in 2023. Minneapolis got it earlier this year. And so, we're starting to see some changes. These groups are really setting some important U.S. precedents for, how do we do this? And some work that, as we're doing some engagement in each of these cities, but we did some initial work looking at health outcomes and health risk in these areas. And what we found for just looking at Houston, San Francisco, Minneapolis, each one of these cities, the youth health risk for obesity, asthma, and poor mental health, every single one, youth were at greater risk for it in high disadvantaged neighborhoods. And we looked at the the park space that was available. So you can actually see the ones that are bounded in sort of turquoise there are the those that have the highest risk of obesity, child obesity. When you look at the green dots, which represents the proportion of park space in that track, you can see there's not a lot of big green circles in the red ones. So they tended to have much less open park space. But when they did, those health risks came down. Okay, this is big. This is a population intervention we can do. If we can add more parks, more green space, more vegetation that kids have access to, we can actually lower health risk in a couple of really key areas. So as I sort of think about and define child-enabling environments, these are ones where the features, so like the physical features or design of these spaces, could be communities, is fostering healthy, productive, and engaged youth, ensuring that they're thriving, not just meeting needs. We're going past meeting needs. We're trying to make sure they're doing really well, they're thriving. So these kind of spaces are ones where the physical and social attributes of those environments are aligning really well with the needs and preferences of kids. But to be able to do this, we need to know more about what those needs and preferences are. And then this is the question I get from a lot of people: can we really afford just to focus on kids, just this one subset of the population? And so I responded to them that we actually already do. There's a nice little article by Esther Greenhouse. She tends to focus on older adults. But when we think of sort of more age-friendly environments, so thinking about across the life course, she says that our environments now are not benign. Okay, the status quo is not benign. They're not. We are being impacted, whether it was intended or not. So if we're going to be impacted, then we should be understanding how to positively impact. But she argues that most of our environments now, in terms of what we tend to base design on, is based on the needs or the abilities of young adult males with average height, reach, physical, cognitive, and sensory abilities. That's a subset. And she also argued that when we don't have a fit between what we need and what we prefer, we can sort of artificially lower a person's level of functioning and thriving. This is very true for older adults, but it's also true for children and youth. So most of our design environments are not inclusive or age-friendly. Okay, so have I convinced you? We should focus a little bit on this. The next thing is, okay, well, where do we start? Where do we begin? And so my suggestion, a good place to start, is we can have transformative impacts on children by thinking about how we design for play. So kids they're inherently motivated to play. Okay, there's a developmental drive, and when they have sort of, certainly their basic needs are being met, then they are going to spend their time in play, and this is the primary mechanism for health and development for kids. We don't tend to think about it that way. So we know now, we have lots of good evidence saying that play is essential for healthy development, and it's right across all the domains. Their physical health, social health, emotional, cognitive, helping them be competent in their environments, regulate their emotions, etc. And we understand now that it's related to these, to their development, because what play does is offers these very low-risk scenarios for kids. So there's not a lot of consequences. You can sort of test, you can try some things out, adapt, and you're accruing skills and knowledge that keep building, and then these are skills that you take forward into to real scenarios. But what my concern is sort of the mindset around play right now is that it tends to be sort of extra, or luxury, or worst case, frivolous. And what we're actually understanding, neuroscience research is really helping us now in this area, because we're actually understanding that play is actually brain building. It's one, that's okay. Go. The brain is actually making sense of itself through these sort of play testing scenarios. And when we look at while kids are playing, all areas of the brain light up. Okay, so we're seeing both short-term and long-term impacts on brain development at molecular level to behavioral level. And so it is no coincidence that we see the most play happening during childhood, because that is the greatest period and the most important period of brain development. So if kids, if they have the opportunity, they're going to be inherently drawn toward play for a lot of these reasons. Where we all come in is that what they play, how they play, the quality of that play is very, very much dependent on the quality and the type of environment that's happening in. So I'm going to focus a little bit on one aspect of play, which is outdoor free play. And when I talk about free play, what we mean there is that it is unstructured. So it's not like a bunch of adults just saying, here, kids, we're going to play, this is what we're going to do. So when kids are making their own choices about what to play. So we know that there are significant benefits of this. When kids have more time for outdoor free play, they're moving more, sitting less, and they're playing for longer amounts of time, all of which are associated with these great health developments. We know that they're developing things like resilience. They learn to cope with emotions and with stress. They start learning to socialize with people outside of their family, particularly. Been related to increases in self-confidence, their sense of identity, and their sense that they can deal with their environments. They can navigate through new scenarios, and that they learn to manage their own risk. And when those outdoor environments are pretty nature-rich, when they've got access to or contact with nature, we have great benefits in physical health. So we see even children that are living in greener neighborhoods. We see lower BMI, lower risk of obesity. Parks and green spaces tend to be associated with greater physical activity. In the social and cognitive development, when kids are at schools that have nature or even have views of nature of their classroom, these have been linked to academic success, improved cognitive functioning, et cetera. And then the mental health end, we know that spending more time outdoors is, lowers levels of stress, lowers heart rate, really consistently associated with better mental health outcomes. And then many of those other health areas we're talking about, there are positive impacts there as well. And when we think of where kids are right now, we have more and more living in cities. We will have more living in cities by 2050. They're expecting 70% of the world's population will be in cities. And when we're thinking about that access to nature and these outdoor green spaces, only a third of children currently have access to open public green space, good nearby access. And what has been very clear is that where, how often, and how children are playing has changed so dramatically in the last 1 to 2 generations. The biggest change we've seen in play behaviors. So I'm going to focus for a sec on neighborhood-based play. So the neighborhood used to be the place, when you're about 7 or 8 years old, you kind of mastered house, home, you're all over that. You're looking for a challenge. The neighborhood tended to be that next arena where you would explore. And typically, before, let's say early 20th century, that tended to be unsupervised. So you weren't necessarily out there with your parents, you were out there with your siblings, your friends, et cetera. And these were incredibly important settings for continued development in a lot of areas. What has happened is the range that we call the independent range, or the activity space of kids, like where they can go without an adult, has shrunk so dramatically in a matter of a generation or two. And actually, I like this graphic, but this is from 1990. This was already a concern there. We have, this work? Yeah. So this is about a family, 4 generations of a family in Sheffield and England, all growing up in the same area. And these blobs are kind of showing the difference from great-grandfather, who could walk 6 miles by himself, is age 8, go fishing, versus his great-grandson, who's 8, who's only allowed to walk to the end of his street. This is typical, and this is already 30 years ago. So we don't have a lot of good evidence about this. We know anecdotally it's happening, but there's some work that looks at sort of independent travel and travel to school, kids being allowed to, I think I should just show hands. How many of you were actually allowed to travel to school outside of a school bus, allowed to travel to school by yourself, as an adult? That's great. That's great. I don't usually get that many. But you can imagine that the environment had an impact in terms of how close you were to your school, whether there were sidewalks, et cetera. So we've seen big changes, big reductions in this active independent travel from kids. So some work that I did a while ago, I was really interested in this. I somehow got permission from parents to put GPS units on their kids, and I tracked them for a couple of weeks. And so this actually represents a GPS track from one child. And I wanted to focus in on not the vehicle-based stuff, but what were they doing, like more pedestrian-based? Where were they walking, biking? And so we could extract what we called their neighborhood activity space. So that's where can they go really on their own? Much, much smaller area. And this is pretty typical. So this represents the home. This is nearby park. This is the furthest distance this child walked in 2 weeks. And these were kids 9, 10 to 12. Okay. So when we looked at across, actually quite a spread. The average is about just over half a mile. We had some kids going like really well over a mile, but we had like 20% of kids that were not going more than 200 yards from their house in good weather at an age when you would really expect that they would be in that neighborhood. When we looked at some of the things that impacted it, there weren't any relations to gender or age even in that area or the type of neighborhood. What impacted them was, did they have independent mobility from their parents? Did they have permission to go places by themselves? And were they already going to school by themselves? So they already, and those things kind of go together where parents feel comfortable kids are getting to school on their own, and so they give them a bit more permission. So beyond kind of distance, we're saying, well, where are they in the community? And what we found is that 90% of their time, so this is out of school time, in their neighborhood activity space was spent in home zones. So that's indoors at home or outdoors, like really in their yard. And actually 51% of their time, lovely summer, light till 9 o'clock, 50% of their time or more was inside. This was more pronounced for suburban, kids living in suburban areas, and those with low independent mobility, not surprising. And so in another study I did recently looking at outdoor and neighborhood play patterns, this is 1,000 kids, 10 to 13. These are getting old. 40% playing less than 30 minutes outdoors a day. 30%, 10 to 13-year-olds could not travel beyond their yard without a parent, without an adult. And when we look at the flip side, where they are spending their time, we're seeing huge amounts of indoor screen-based activity. 2/3 are spending 2 or more hours on screens per day. 10% spending 7 or more hours. This is out of school time. This is now affecting sleep. So you don't have 7 hours outside of school most days. So we're seeing this across the board. We're seeing this decline in time spent outdoors and in nature, significantly less in previous generations, much more pronounced for girls, as well as racial and ethnic minority children. We're also seeing this trend toward reducing or eliminating recess, which I'll talk in a sec, and a rise in time spent on indoor activities, a lot of which is screen-based. So this is what we now have. We now have a disconnect between kids and their outdoor spaces, and in some cases, a lot of cases, a discomfort in those outdoor spaces. So much so, we've actually the nature of childhood has actually fundamentally changed for many kids. So there's a study done in 2006 in Amsterdam, looking at 3 generations of the same family, still living in the same neighborhood. And they said the grandparents, you could really characterize their childhood as, like, when they weren't at school, most of their life was outside. Within 1 to 2 generations, that had flip-flopped entirely, and most kids, their childhood be characterized primarily as an indoor childhood, and in some cases, a backseat childhood. So we have a lot more kids that are, in vehicles, commuting with parents, commuting to activities, or just on, family patterns. So the result of a lot of this is kids are actually disappearing from our communities, from our public spaces, our outdoor spaces. And there are significant consequences of this. So I try to talk to parents who, a lot of times they're making decisions because they're doing it for protective reasons, and I try to gently remind them that there may be some negative impacts. And when we've seen this decline in outdoor play, we've seen a big rise in psychopathologies amongst kids, particularly anxiety and depression. And also seeing some really worrying stuff with teens. Huge spikes in depressive episodes, a lot of which has occurred since 2010, and actually some of these, this is before COVID, 2019. This has changed significantly. So a little question to you here. So why? Why do you think we've had this sort of massive shift? What do you think is at play here that we've seen this big shift in a couple of generations? If you have the mic, we can. Oh, we got one up here. You want to yell to start?
Yeah, I can yell.
Yeah.
I think one of the things on why people don't want their children running away from the house is just they're nervous they're going to get kidnapped. And people are not inherently nice sometimes.
Absolutely. Stranger danger. Number one thing parents cite for keeping their kids, not letting them go somewhere without them. Yep, another one?
The decreased walkability and increase of cars.
Absolutely. Decreased walkability of our communities, more cars.
Kind of tying into the whole not wanting, your kids to be in an unsafe situation. The propagation of like the internet and the news just really shining a light on just the dangers of the outside world for kids.
Yes. Yeah, much general increase in our sense that kids are more at danger from lots of things, not even just strangers. Yeah.
I mean, I just think kids just don't want to go outside anymore. Like, they'd rather just play Fortnite with their friends than, and like for parents, that's easier too, right? Like, you don't have to take them anywhere. Like, it's just easier both ways.
100%. 100%. It's not, there are some kids who say, yeah, given the choice, I would rather be inside, usually on a screen. Yeah. Another one?
Okay. Sometimes, sometimes it's availability of green spaces nearby. Like sometimes you have to drive very far away, and it's really not worth it.
Yeah, and if it's really far and parents are not comfortable with their kids driving on their own, then it's now the parent having to take them, and then like, I can't fit this in right now. And we've got piano lessons, and we've got soccer practice. And one more over here. Oh, 2 more. We'll do these 2.
There also might be a disconnect with parents as well with nature, so it's hard to, pass that down to their kids.
Very good point is that some parents are now of the generation that they themselves had a disconnect and maybe discomfort with nature, and now, so they're raising kids with what they are comfortable with, or where their discomfort levels or preferences are being reinforced. Yes?
I think one of the reasons might be the fact that both parents are now working long hours and they don't have enough time to be the supervisor now.
Yes.
So they prefer to increase the security of their child.
Absolutely. More, very few parents at home, and so more, more structured schedule, more kids who are in after-school programs, daycare, etc. So there's less time overall. So yes, all of the above. We've had shifts in. There's no silver bullet because there's so many things that have shifted. One thing I want to say about the stranger danger. The actual chance of a child being abducted by someone they do not know has plummeted. But we don't think that. We have the opposite impression. Why? Why do we think that there's still a lot of kidnapping going on? What's that? You hear more about it. A kid, like in New York today, could be kidnapped, and you will hear about it. You could hear about a kid in another country. So the media around it, the numbers have plummeted. Chance of a child being, the number one child abductor is a non-custodial parent. So the stranger danger, this perception, which is the thing that most parents cite as why they're not letting their kids do it, is actually not at all borne out by the evidence. But as you say, we got more people living in cities, but more urbanization, more traffic, and as those are getting denser, we're losing some of those natural spaces, changes in family structure, commuting patterns, work patterns, busier, more programmed lifestyles, like right down the list. Anyone heard of this new book? Heard anything about this? So Jonathan Haidt, a sociologist, this is just sort of hot off the press, and he's trying to track like why we're seeing this huge increase, particularly among Gen Z, in mental health issues, and is tying it in many ways to the pervasive use of cell phones and social media, and that we're having a huge impact on mental health. But he also ties it to the decline in unsupervised play, that this is negatively impacted. And so when you think about play being one of, and especially unstructured play or unsupervised, being one of the primary drivers of health and development, we've had a big decline in that. It's no wonder that we're seeing some of these health impacts. So we have all these things that are kind of combining to reduce opportunities for an appeal of the outdoor and community-based activities. So I want to talk to they prefer to stay in and play Fortnite, so we're not designing appealing enough places that it can counter the screen-based activity. So I did a little bit of a dive in this a couple of years ago and saying, well, what are we seeing in terms of patterns? And I sort of used this idea of this indoor-outdoor backseat childhood. And so this, I can't remember how many kids there were, good number of kids. We sort of looked at some of these patterns, and there were no kids that had an outdoor childhood. That was not a thing. But there were some that had a pretty high outdoor component. And when we looked at the commonalities, sort of represented by this blue blob, they had a lot of independent mobility. They had the ability from their parents to actually go places on their own. But there's also a lot of stuff nearby that they could go to. There was some appealing stuff that was pretty close by. So not just green spaces, but mixed use places. They didn't spend a lot of time in vehicles. They didn't spend a lot of time on screen time. But they had this there was a lot of resources nearby. When we looked at the kids that spent a lot of time indoors or indoors backseat, we had two sort of types. We had some that had these very, very structured schedules, doing a lot of extracurricular activities, not a lot of time for free play. So they weren't spending a lot of time on screens, but they didn't really have a lot of free time. And the other undergroup, they didn't have a lot of barriers, obstacles, but they were spending an enormous amount of time on screens. But one thing, when we looked at the environment, we found this weird, looking at spatially, this weird thing where a lot of these kids in this area also lived in what I call these residential islands. There's nothing nearby. We're building a lot of communities like this. This one, even just in a short space. If you can only walk a couple blocks and you're limited to what's in there, there's nothing. Maybe you can go there. So maybe I'm allowed to go there. So the lack of permission and the lack of actually things nearby are like really combining to impact their neighborhood use. So we need to be thinking with kids, we need to be thinking micro neighborhoods. We can't think about, oh, this is available within, half a mile or a mile. Where we really need to be thinking about, because they're so restricted sometimes their activities, until that permissiveness changes, then we need to really think about what resources they have available. And these nearby affordances and kind of where they're located and whether there's stuff around them for their primary interests, that's where, as planners, designers, et cetera, this is where we can have an impact. So how do we do it? How am I doing for time? All right, okay. So how do we do it? So there's lots of different vehicles for doing this, and I myself probably try to cover the first three. So we need more research to sort of back up. We need more evidence to show, to understand what is going to be effective, what's going to be going to have positive impacts, what are the barriers and facilitators. And then we need to use that knowledge for informed design that really honors and supports the needs of kids, including their ideas. And one way to do that is actually integrate them more into design, decision-making processes. But we really, to have systemic changes, we really need to also be thinking about that policy level that's going to be dedicated to the rights and best interests of kids. So where to focus? And my things I'm choosing today, a little more planning and landscape oriented, but lots of nuggets, hopefully, for the architecture students. So when we're thinking of, particularly for me, thinking about where are they spending their time? These are schools and childcare spaces, and then these neighborhood community and recreation spaces. So when we think of these areas, if I'm just thinking even just at the outdoors, what can we do? There's all kinds of things that we can do. From school gardens, integrating much more vegetation into school landscapes. There's the policy, the program end, having outdoor classrooms or outdoor curricula. Keep or extend recess, spend more time. Also the outdoors in all weathers. We tend to take kids in very quickly when there's poor weather. But there's a lot that can be, the built environment or the gear that they're wearing can actually really extend that time. So we shouldn't be so quick to pull them in. When we think of neighborhoods, really thinking about that child-enabling pedestrian infrastructure, including programs or understanding where are the sort of safe routes to school where kids can be, actively going to school on their own. Thinking about park and green space within a very short distance of everybody. Street trees really have a huge impact, actually. There's a couple of really interesting articles out there. Community gardens, concentrating on our green and blue infrastructure, et cetera. So many things that we can do at the design and or policy or program level. So examples of some of the research. So this is a study that I'm doing right now, sort of looking at differences in play in outdoor playgrounds. And conventional playgrounds where we have sort of play structure and can be sort of asphalt versus a natural playground offer very different opportunities for play. And we said, with lots of benefits from this nature-rich outdoor play, and we're starting to see, some real interest across the board in naturalizing or renaturalizing outdoor spaces. But I get a little concerned when I see what some people are calling natural playgrounds. So I'm trying to understand, okay, what's that continuum and what happens for play across that? So for now, sort of developed this idea of this continuum from conventional to very naturalized. It's conventionally, these plastic metal play structures tend to be non-natural ground surfaces, et cetera. Not a lot of loose parts, not a lot of vegetation. What I'm seeing a lot when people are calling natural playgrounds, and I go to these places, and it's a play structure built out of wood. and that's it. And I'm like, where's the nature? Okay, it's a natural material, yes, great. But it's still closer to conventional than it is to a natural environment. And then we're starting to see more of that, a little bit hybrid, a little bit of both. And then definitely more that are in the naturalized. So I did a study in San Francisco, sort of 5 public play spaces across this continuum. One main tool that I use is behavior mapping. So this is an in situ observational protocol. One of the few tools where we can actually capture behavior and characteristics of the environment and spatial location at the same time. So we use a GIS platform to sort of record, and then it opens up all these opportunities for spatial and environmental analyses. So here's an example from, this is from a place in Santa Barbara a couple of years ago. You can see all the pink dots are play events that we have recorded. When we do these in a GIS profile or platform, we can also produce heat maps and understand, okay, where, yeah, here there's kind of spread across, but really where are they spending their time? And then I also utilize, this is important, of having the right tools. So had to a couple years ago when we were trying to understand and capture play, realized that we don't really have a good set of categories. There were sort of these 4 were sort of available in some regard, but they were all developed to understand play that's happening indoors. And we're finding we're like, this is just not capturing what we're seeing. And so in addition to these 4, we have created these other 4. And bioplay being one where we're actually saying where kids are playfully interacting with living things in their environment. When you're not in a natural space, when there's no nature there, we're not going to see the bioplay. But also recognizing restorative play, we tend to think of kids just wanting to be constantly active on play spaces. That is not the case. Some kids don't want that experience, and not all kids want the all physical all the time. And so we were seeing a lot of this sort of quieter sort of retreat, and we didn't have a way of capturing it. So from the analysis that we've done so far, what we're seeing is that those spaces that are closer to the end of that natural continuum, we're seeing much greater diversity in the types of play. Those conventional ones, and even the natural conventional, there was no difference between whether the play structure was built out of wood or built out of metal. It was only supporting a really limited amount of primarily physical play. So in these natural ones, we see much more support and uptake of exploratory, imaginative, expressive, and bioplay. And they were really supporting sort of a range of activity intensities. So we're just having a much nicer range across these spaces, and some good risky play when we had the right features. So I want you to be thinking about, we need to be thinking about designing these places carefully, and really be thinking how we're using the term natural playground. So are we okay? What's our time? Just give me a, okay, all right, let me just, okay. I'm gonna just flip ahead, so, if anyone's interested in, I have lots of articles about the behavior mapping work that we've done, and they're really helpful for us understanding the environmental characteristics that are supporting play. One thing that's really been emerging is how much topography is impacting the play opportunities that kids can, we tend to design these really flat play spaces, and just by having some slopes and some uneven areas where you're actually opening up play opportunities. So in terms of design and policy, we need to sort of move beyond these sort of fenced-in play spaces. Because even when kids are there, we're still even restricting their behavior in these spaces. No end of signs about what they can and can't do. There are a lot of play spaces that say you cannot be there unless you have an adult supervising. So right away, that policy is limiting those kids from being able to access that place by themselves. Teens especially, we really, we tend to sort of vilify teens a lot. There's actually research that shows just a crowd of teenagers, a small crowd of teenagers, most other age groups will perceive them as threatening. When they're not, they're sitting and talking to each other, and they're perceived as threatening. So we want to think beyond just providing these sort of play spaces, these designated children's spaces, and really thinking about all the outdoor spaces, or like a network within our community, sort of this open space system. And so some ways we can do that is change standard operating procedure. Don't go with the status quo. Don't accept the way that we have done things. These are often pretty limiting and unsupportive, sometimes somewhat detrimental. So think about activating the whole infrastructure of a city, community, neighborhood, whatever it may be. Think about and really support these everyday engagements and mobilities of kids. And looking at the sort of playful community spaces, not just at the macro level, but that micro level as well. So thinking about, here's where we're tying the architecture to the landscape to the planning. These individual settings, but also the connection between them and the roots between them are extremely, extremely important. Good thing is there's lots of good resources for designing, planning for and with children. We have some, good case studies, some measures that we're seeing in practice that have been quite successful. So in Barcelona, their infrastructure sort of lends itself toward this, but they have limited or taken away traffic, motorized traffic, in the interior of these super blocks, and really opened these up as citizen spaces. So yes, this is great for kids. It's also great for older adults, for families. They are citizen spaces. We're seeing play streets where we're even on a temporary basis, kind of cutting off traffic. This has been so successful in London. They have so many play streets. They're actually able to develop these play quarters, so these networks of connected play streets. We need to think differently about community spaces, particularly those maybe around schools or sort of community spaces, facilities. Paris started this program in 2018 where they began understanding that their schools are one of their best, biggest public assets, started investing a lot more into vegetating them, and then opening them up to after-school use. So these become community public spaces, and there also have been these cool hubs, particularly in heat waves. I'm just going to skip ahead. So looking for these opportunities to create sort of playful encounters, playful spaces. And it's not just kids that like these spaces. So many of the pop-up play things, there's some good examples around the world. More often than not, it's adults that are taking advantage. I'm just going to move ahead. Okay, and then finally, integrating youth into these processes. I'll give you 2 seconds here. So I've done quite a bit of work in building processes and tools for engaging kids in both research and design. And we know that not just the products of that participatory work impacts youth, but being involved in that process has big benefits for them. I often get this question, but can they really do anything meaningful? The answer is absolutely yes. I work with some pretty young kids doing co-design. They're more than capable of articulating their needs. They have really innovative design ideas. They tend to be more inclusive inherently. They tend to think about other users without being prompted. And they actually they're less constrained by the box. So we actually get more innovative ideas brought to the table often. So going back to your idea of collected, so allowing these diverse ideas and skills to converge and thinking that the kids have ideas and skills that can and should be integrated into more innovative and holistic design solutions. Like that. I'm just going to shift ahead. So think that there's many different access points for kids. It's not just in design. You can assessment and evaluation, programming, planning, design development, even construction and maintenance, and then also at the policy making level. So in my last minute or so here, so I recently completed a co-design project with some grade 5 students. It's about 9, 10 years old. This big beloved play structure at their school. It's at the end of its useful life, has to come down. And so the district wanted the kids to actually be really informing the design. This presentation will be shared with you, so you can, I'm going to skip a little fast, but you can go back and look. So one thing that we focus on with co-design for kids is thinking about what are their priority play elements, but we kind of move them into play experiences and saying, what are those experiences that you want to have? We understand those needs, we prioritize them, and then like we created a design brief for the school architects, and they had the freedom to say, oh, we have many different ways that we can provide those experiences, and they weren't limited to saying we got to provide. They want a slide, and they want a bench. So this experience framework is really helpful for co-design, particularly with kids. I'm going to move ahead. I had more than I thought. So we did a whole range of activities. One group we only did about 3 sessions. One we did about 11 sessions. So we're trying to understand if we have more time and more engagement, do we actually see more complex design ideas that come out, more higher quality of them. And part of that process is actually teaching them. We talked to them about what do good play spaces look like. How do you design natural spaces? We give them a materials and a plant palette to work with, so that they're actually making informed decisions. So, right, I'm going to skip through. So we actually get to the point like where they, after a long period, they start developing. They do sort of bubble diagramming. They move into full designs, and they have to articulate their design vision, and they have to pick their top 5 elements and experiences. And when you see these design visions from these kids, these are 9, 10-year-olds, they have a pretty good sense of what they want. I love this. We want a fun, safe place so no one will get severely hurt, but people will still take risks. We all want to be a playground with lots and lots of space. So then we do a range of activities with them, and we keep extracting and synthesizing what are these priority elements, what are these priority experiences, and then we develop a design brief with recommendations for the designers. One key part of this process was that the architects and landscape architects had to agree to bring the designs back to the kids to show them how they were honoring, how they'd incorporated their priorities, and give them the chance to give feedback. Okay, so I'm just going to shift. Wow, I had more than I thought. So we can do this. We can provide these healthy child-enabling environments, but we need, catching you guys before you're in practice, they need you to sort of understand that they need these environments and these opportunities. You're watching for them and understanding how we can be not only integrating them, but their needs and priorities in anything that we are designing. So I'm going to suggest we do all of this. We can create meaningful and transformative design solutions for and with children. So hopefully I've converted you all to this day, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you.
Great. Just before I say, this QR code, so we developed a playbook for this co-design process that goes through everything that we did and how to do it. And then the design brief that came out of it, that is available to look at and download if it's of interest. So, all right.
So we are going to open it for questions, and we usually like to start with the students. So any students have questions? All right.
So my question is actually about like community outreach with regards to the development, both of a lot of these, a lot of the the playground spaces or whatever, but also just with parents. So I guess I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, how do you communicate to parents in a way that like what kids are planning for and collaborating on is like better for the kids than the traditional playground? I know when I was a teacher in poor communities, oftentimes like parents, if you were to just propose like, hey, we're going to put some tree stumps and blocks in your kids' playground and let them figure it out, people would have been like, oh, that's not equitable, because on its face, it's not if like more, other communities. So anyways, that's just kind of a question. How do you communicate to that?
Yeah. And so I want to be really careful that I'm never parent shaming. but I do think that parents generally, there are some misconceptions, and I think they've heard so much about the things, and they're trying to be so protective about the things that might possibly hurt their kids, is that they're not understanding that there might be these, but by limiting them in other ways, they might be limiting some opportunities. So trying to talk to parents and help them understand that just this, free play, non-screen based, it can have huge learning and development outcomes. But usually when, there's often resistance. Parents are the biggest group for which they get resistance. So this is where we often start with the kids. And so any, co-design or any community engagement, we usually engage the kids first and then present those ideas to the parents. And they're much less likely to shoot down their kids' ideas. But part of that is we generally need to be more informed. We need to understand what is actually really happening. And so when you have those opportunities to sort of talk to parents and share, what is the reality, and that, if you kind of do these things that don't feel comfortable for you, there's not as much risk as you think, and there's a lot maybe more benefits that you think. So trying to balance that, but by no means am I sort of shaming parents, but it's a key group where we need to kind of shift the understanding, and some of that needle is not really going to move. Parents are still the gatekeepers for their kids' activities, so they need to understand. And if we can provide environments that are feeling more comfortable and safer for their kids, that kind of will go part and parcel. But there have to be conversations that counter the narrative that we mostly get through the media. So now you can help. Now that you.
All right, I'm curious, you talked to the perception that teenagers were dangerous and you have these groups of people. How are you looking at the equitable use of these spaces like at night, where you might have a homeless population or just someone who's out wandering, like, they're just trying to go somewhere, but it's creating this illusion that there's this dangerous setting that now parents are seeing the spaces in one view in the evening, but then totally other during the day.
So, you mean unsafe for teens at night? Is that what you mean?
Just the perception of it being unsafe. Like if a homeless individual is sleeping on a bench.
Yeah.
I mean, not that doing anything wrong, but now it's scary.
Yeah, and that is a really pervasive perception. It's a big barrier, and we're seeing much more in terms of unhoused populations and being in and even living in these public spaces. So there's a lot of things that need to happen there. I think I think it's tough. It's a tough argument to say no, it's actually okay. But there's infrastructure that can help places at night. Like one thing that so many parks do not have adequate lighting, or thinking about. I don't tell you what you want to think about sight lines, and you want to be a little bit careful about where you might be providing some spaces that are. I'm not all about being able to see kids every minute of the day, but you need to be careful looking for those spaces that could actually pose a bit of hazard. So there's the bigger social things that need to happen, but I think there are some design things that we can also be thinking about to make these spaces feel a little bit safer. But I know the other part is a hard thing to counter right now. Really good points.
When it comes to like the naturalized play spaces, how would you address the accessibility concerns that come with that?
Sorry?
Like accessibility concerns.
Yes, this is, these can be two things that are really at odds with each other. It's like, lovely, yes, let's put mulch down. Mulch is not an accessible service. And so you could be decreasing somebody's access to that space. So there are, I've seen some really, really good solutions, and this is where there may need to be some artificial materials, or we need to be thinking about if we're using natural materials. There are some accessible pathways that you can do with natural materials. So being aware I'm not like all natural at all expense, because that is a really good point, is that things like turf and rubber surfacing and asphalt or concrete are are accessible surfaces. And so there has to be a balance there. But I do think there are some natural materials that provide that a little bit more. The other thing I didn't talk about, but I'm starting to look a lot more about thermal comfort on these outdoor play spaces, and materials like rubber and asphalt, particularly the heat that they are giving off. There's another health issue there, and so if we can, I know that there's actually some. I won't get into the science of it because I don't know it, but I know that there's some work in some sort of permeable, semi-natural materials that they're looking at for play spaces. So I think we might have more options down the road, but it's a very good point that we need to be making sure that the natural part is not also making them less accessible for some populations. There's some good precedents out there about how to balance that, which I can share.
I had another question about.
Oh, there.
I'm super interested in the age range between like 13 to 16, where they're older than a child, but they're not necessarily a teenager yet.
Yep.
What are some like design elements that you feel like specifically target that age range, that like says like, I recognize you as not a child and I like acknowledge your autonomy, but it's still like a play structure?
Right. Yes. So actually, one part I skipped past there. Another one of my PhD students were working on an environmental audit tool for youth that they can use to assess their community spaces, like particularly focusing on public, green, rec, and leisure spaces. As kids getting older, they stop thinking about play. They don't want you talking about play, so we talk about recreation or leisure. But at that point there, and this is it, we see this developmental shift where the social activities become much more important than some of the physical ones. And so when I talk to teens a lot, they're like, yeah, sometimes we want to climb on that stuff, and we don't want to be told that it's not for us, because that's the other thing is, they say, no, that's for the younger kids. That's not for you. So we can provide some like more challenging sort of teen-focused sort of physical activities, things like ropes courses and things like that, not just skate parks. But it's also providing opportunities for those social. There's a lot of public spaces don't have good seating options, or they have like a bench where you're sitting two people beside each other and you don't have sort of these collective seating spaces. So trying to provide that infrastructure, but then also the policies and the culture also needs to support the fact that they are legitimate users of that space. So we need to talk to them more and particularly get them, they really know what they want. So talking to them more about what they want. And it tends to be really social focused. Start moving into the tweens and teen years. So.
There we go. So I was wondering, you're talking about not fencing kids in, but then with traffic safety, how do you balance both of those needs while creating a space that feels more open?
Yeah. So there are times you need a fence. 100%, particularly when it's the barrier between things like traffic. But it's being kind of judicious with those, and that it's not about penning kids in. There's also ways to provide barriers that don't sort of feel like a fence. And so you can be, accomplishing this with vegetation, which might also be providing some wind buffer and some more comfortable spaces. So part of it is that it's not just fencing them in. It's saying, okay, we can't let them go everywhere. And if we're not watching them all the time, they're going to get hurt. And this is the only space they should be. The other spaces are adult spaces. So there's a lot of pieces there to kind of counteract. So fence is sort of a symbolic thing. So I'm not saying don't use them when you need them. One thing we found with the kids we were just doing the co-design with, part of their fence between some play spaces was broken. There's a couple of like slats that were missing, and then the school repaired it, and they were so mad. They're like, that was such a fun little cut through that fence. It was this little secret spot we could just kind of get through. And so sometimes the fences actually can provide opportunities. So if you think of it in a playful way, if you need it, think about ways that either doesn't feel like a fence or maybe has some playful opportunities that it provides.
How do you see the relationship between child education and your work? How do you can combine those two together?
Child education?
Yeah.
In what sense?
And like, how can you? Because a lot of time, children are in school, and how can you put your work, all this research, into a area that they're spending a lot of time? They are all together, but they don't use it in a very like outdoors way.
Right. Okay. And I mean, I really focused on outdoor spaces, and this is not all I focus on. We should be applying some of these principles to the design of schools as well. And there are some sort of really new, innovative approaches to how we even design schools. But I mean, the outdoors, like schoolyards, are the least leveraged asset. Like, it's such a great asset that most schools do not leverage. And part of that is the perception amongst educators and parents that when they're in the school, they're learning. When they're outside, they're just blowing off steam. And so part of it is understanding there are huge learning opportunities, formal or informal. So yes, focus on bringing some curriculum outside. COVID actually helped in that way, because a lot of schools were forced to be outside, and it was long enough that some teachers were like, actually, I can do this. I can bring some of my curriculum outside. So we saw some of that sort of staying, not completely, but there's a cultural. It's the understanding that play is actually really beneficial learning, and so it's not a break from learning. It's just a different kind of learning. So and it can also be providing those playful opportunities inside the school. So it's not always structured stuff, and that balance may be a little more beneficial. But we can apply some of these same principles to the design of the indoor spaces that kids are spending time in. So I just focused outdoors for today. Yes?
What kind of design elements should we put to encourage that kind of activity? Like for example, where I'm from, we get a lot of rain, so anything that is not covered is not going to be used that often.
Yes. Yeah. So this is where we need to be really thinking about, especially when we're talking about outdoor spaces, we need to think of that climatic context. So if you're in a place I live in a place there's a ton of snow, or a lot of heat, or a lot of wind, or a lot of rain, the environment, we design these spaces and then we don't provide any protection from these really common weather and climate issues. Particularly now when we're seeing more extreme weather conditions, we need to, in order for these still to be spaces where kids can go, we need to be thinking in a more sort of climate resilient way. And really understanding what are the key issues here, and then how do we design for that. So like vegetation and shade sails and roofs, gazebos, like there are lots of ways to do it. It actually tends to be the last thing that gets thought about. It should be one of the first to me in terms of doing that. I would say if you want to have the biggest impact in a quick way in a school or another playground, put in loose parts. All the stuff that's attached is so limiting. Put in the stuff that they can build with and move and manipulate and dig in, and like the water and dirt and sand and acorns and rocks. Doesn't even have to be natural stuff. When you give kids the more things that they can, more opportunities to manipulate and do or build, you exponentially change the play opportunities. So there's all kinds of issues that go around with loose parts, goes missing, and how do you maintain it? But thinking about that, there's a huge jump in play value when you can let them actually change their own play environments.
All right, we probably have time for one more if anyone has a final question.
Right here in front.
Sorry.
Hey, so going back to that portion of like loose parts, I was curious, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned something about just fort building, and that many cultures seem to be doing it, like just across many cultures. I was just curious, did you see any patterns in that, like why it seemed children would always go towards building forts? Is that similar to the loose parts?
Yeah, so yes. So it's not just an environment they're playing in, it's an environment they're building for themselves. We know that there are some control issues that children are drawn to, like I'm controlling my own space. They tend to be smaller scaled spaces, which is a better fit for them. Those spaces where you're actually controlling who can go in and out or what you can see in and out is a key place where kids learn sort of privacy regulation and we see some of this retreat. I talk about restorative things, like kids sometimes need retreat spaces, and these smaller spaces they tend to be drawn toward that. They tend to personalize them quite a bit, and so you can get this whole sense that this is their territory, and then it can constantly change. My brother and I built a fort for about 2.5 years. Like it just was never done. We just kept working on this fort, and it just changed the whole time. We never actually played in it. We just built it the whole time, and I mean that was such a strong play activity for me as a kid. So there's a lot of things about why kids might be sort of drawn to building and sort of dwelling in these spaces they've built for themselves, and they're a little bit more scaled to them, where they can kind of control who sees them and who they see and who's allowed in. No girls allowed, that kind of thing. So thanks for that question. Anything else? All right, thank you for the great questions. Really appreciate that. Thanks.